I do now want to turn to a different conflict that you and I have talked about at length, and that is the war between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think a peace deal here in the Middle East means anything for that conflict? Because Ukrainian President Zelensky, he said that the peace deal, quote, brings more hope for peace in other regions where life is still under threat. What do you make of that?
So, I mean, I think what he hopes is that President Trump puts the same level of attention to the Russia-Ukraine problem and the same amount of pressure on the true belligerent. In the case in the Middle East, it was Hamas. In the case of Eastern Europe, it's Russia. So from Zelensky's point of view, the lesson learned from this would be that President Trump goes and puts real pressure on President Putin and Russia. And therefore that gives him, that gives Zelensky some optimism. We'll have to see.
And what specifically are you looking out for that conflict? Because you were in Ukraine recently. What was your experience on the ground like? And what do you think that the world needs to know about this conflict that perhaps isn't in the international conversation?
So you're right. I just finished a couple of weeks there, and it wasn't significantly different than 4 months ago when I was there. I still don't see any cracks in Ukrainian societal resilience. I see their forces, their ground forces getting smarter and smarter, and their air forces really developing. But I did see a lot more attacks by Putin and Russia, particularly drone and cruise missile attacks. The last night I was there was an all-out strike on Kiev's electrical power grid that took down power through a lot of the city. I would say that war is maintaining at a pretty high level, both ground and missile attacks. But I do not see Ukraine losing, and I don't see how Ukraine can reoccupy new, Crimea or territory they've lost. But I don't see them losing much more on the battlefield, and they don't see them collapsing against the Russian threat.
And in recent months, President Trump met with Zelensky. He met with Putin. He's been trying to broker peace between the two. What do you want to see from the Trump administration and President Trump specifically?
So he needs to bring pressure on Putin. And the first thing is sanctions. We've discussed this before. Sanctions on the countries that receive fossil fuels, oil and natural gas through the shadow fleet. That's China, India, and Turkey. President Trump, for other reasons, has selectively targeted tariffs on India, but he needs to do it on China and Turkey so that both those countries and India stop receiving that fuel. If they stop receiving that shadow fleet oil and natural gas, that's going to put a serious limitation on Putin's ability to conduct this war. He gets 40% of his external, of his exports, of his funding for the government from fossil fuels. And of that money, he then spends 40% of the federal budget on the military, on the war. So you can really bring pressure on him. The second one I would do is, I know President Zelensky really wants tomahawks. I've used tomahawks a lot in my career. I'm not opposed to tomahawks, but it's really, those will be low numbers. What we really need to do is make sure we're providing them a weapon called the Extended Range Attack Munition, or ERAM. I believe we can get them 2,000 to 3,000 over the next 2 years. This is a long-range, low-cost cruise missile that can just hammer Russian forces, hold them accountable for what they're doing, impose cost on them when they try to attack in a way that the Ukrainians have not been able to do with their own limited long-range strike and such. So from my point of view, give them the right weapons. And we also need to give them defensive weapons. This is the air defense weapons like Patriot and AMRAAM missiles. Give them the defensive weapons, the offensive weapons, do the sanctions. If we bring all three of those together, Putin at some point's got to decide this is not, he's got what he's got, and he needs to, quote, declare victory and at least get a temporary ceasefire for now. And in that temporary ceasefire, we can continue to strengthen Ukraine and make Putin's long-term goals unexecutable.
I know you said at some point Putin needs to stop. When do you think that point is going to be realistically?
My thought process is that he's going to try one more summer offensive next summer. So I think realistically, this war, stretches on to next September, October. Now, to be honest, to be frank, I can't assess Russian societal resilience. I'm not allowed to travel there, and I don't want to travel there. But if that were to collapse, then it would be earlier. But if Russian societal resilience stays strong or as is, I think it's late next summer is when Putin realizes this is an unwinnable war for him.